90 minutes. That is how long it took to destroy a British cavalry regiment that had existed in one form or another since 1690. 90 minutes from the moment the dust cloud appeared on the southeastern horizon at 8:30 in the morning of the 21st of November, 1941, to the moment a single acting officer in a Hold Crusader tank looked around at the smoking desert and realized he was one of fewer than a dozen survivors still operational from a regiment that had rolled out that dawn with 57 tanks. The 7th Queen's Own Hussars had started the day as one of the 3 armored regiments spearheading the central thrust of Operation Crusader. By lunchtime, the regiment had effectively ceased to exist. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Bias, was dead. Both squadron leaders were dead or captured. The radios were going off the air one by one, and the men still alive inside their tanks were listening to their own comrades die over the intercom. A war correspondent attached to 7th Armored Division headquarters later wrote that nobody who was there could explain exactly what had happened because the thing had unfolded faster than a human being could process. They had seen the tanks of the 21st Panzer Division deploy. They had heard the first shots. And then the whole regiment was gone. Not in the way infantry regiments in the Great War had been gone, ground down over weeks in the mud of the Somme, gone in the time it takes to cook and eat a meal. This is the story of that morning and the afternoon that followed it, and the next catastrophic day after that. It is the story of men who drove British tanks that were not good enough into the fire of German guns that were far too good, and who did it anyway because they had been ordered to, and because the men next to them were doing the same. It is the story of the worst day the British Armored Corps had ever had in the desert. And it begins, as so many disasters begin, with a plan that looked brilliant on a map in Cairo. The plan was called Operation Crusader. It had been drafted by General Sir Claude Auchinleck, the new Commander-in-Chief Middle East, and it had a single overriding purpose: relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk. Tobruk had been under siege since the 10th of April, 1941, when Rommel's Africa Corps, driving eastwards in a lightning counterstroke, had surrounded the port and trapped 30,000 Commonwealth troops inside its perimeter. The garrison, predominantly the 9th Australian Division, reinforced later by the 71st British Infantry Division and the Polish Carpathian Brigade, had held out for over 7 months, resupplied only by the Royal Navy's inshore squadron running the gauntlet of Luftwaffe bombers every night from Alexandria. Tobruk had become a symbol. Churchill demanded it be relieved. Auchinleck knew that if it fell, the whole British position in North Africa would unravel, and the Germans would be standing on the Suez Canal inside a season. The plan, therefore, had to work. Crusader was built around 2 British corps. 13 corps would pin the Axis forces along the frontier wire between Sollum and Sidi Omar, holding them in place while XXX Corps, the armored fist of the 8th Army, swept wide around the southern flank through open desert. The objective of this armored hook was Sidi Rezeg, a sun-bleached dirt airfield roughly 18 miles southeast of Tobruk, perched on the middle of 3 escarpments that rippled the desert landscape south of the coast. Whoever held the Sidi Rezeg escarpment could dominate the Trig Capuzzo, the main east-west desert track, and cut Rommel's besieging forces in half. The Tobruk garrison would then break out south, link up with XXX Corps at Aduda, and the siege would be broken. On paper, the arithmetic favored the British decisively. XXX Corps alone fielded over 700 tanks across 3 armored brigades, the 4th, the 7th, and the untested 22nd. The Africa Corps, by contrast, had around 260 panzers. The British would outnumber the Germans in armor by almost 3-1. Auchinleck's staff believed that even with Rommel's tactical brilliance, raw numbers would tell. They were wrong. Catastrophically, comprehensively wrong. And the reason they were wrong was sitting in British tank parks at that very moment, painted desert pink, awaiting the order to move forward. The tanks were the problem. The 7th Armored Brigade, the central column of the attack and the unit that would bear the worst of what was coming, was equipped with a mixture of A-13 cruiser Mark IV variants, a 1-5 Crusader Mark I, and Mark II tanks, and in the case of the 7th Queen's Own Hussars, a regiment of Vickers Mark V-B light tanks. The A-13 was a mechanically unreliable design that had been rushed into service. The Crusader was fast, capable of over 26 miles per hour across open desert, but its armor was thin, maxing at 49 millimeters on the Mark II, and its turret was prone to catching fire when hit. The Mark V-B light tank was worse. It had been designed in the mid-1930s as a reconnaissance vehicle. Its armor was only 14 millimeters thick at its strongest point, and its main armament was a 15-millimeter Besa heavy machine gun. Against infantry in the open, it was a useful weapon. Against a German Panzer IV mounting a short-barreled 75-millimeter gun, it was a mobile coffin. What united every tank the British fielded at Crusader, from the heaviest Matilda infantry tank down to the lightest Honey reconnaissance vehicle, was a main gun called the Ordnance Quick-Firing 2-pounder, a 40-millimeter piece with a maximum effective anti-armor range of around 1,000 yards. Beyond that, its shot simply did not penetrate. The Germans had no such limitation. The standard anti-tank gun of the Afrika Korps Panzer battalions by November 1941 was the POC-38, a 50-millimeter weapon with a muzzle velocity of over 1,100 meters per second and an effective range of more than 1,000 yards. Above that sat the weapon that would become legend in the Western Desert. The Flak-18 and Flak-36, a dual-purpose 88-millimeter anti-aircraft gun that Rommel had first used against tanks at Arras in 1940, when British Matildas had come close to unhinging the German offensive against France. Rommel had never forgotten that lesson. He had brought the 88s to Africa and integrated them directly into his panzer formations. Each typical panzer battalion in the Afrika Korps by November 1941 had between 3 and 5 heavy anti-tank guns attached, either on self-propelled mounts or towed behind half-tracks that could unlimber the gun and have it in action within minutes. The 88 could penetrate the front armor of any British tank in service at ranges where the British 2-pounder could not even scratch the paint of a Panzer IV. The tactical consequence of this mismatch was simple. If a British tank wanted to kill a German tank, it had to close to under 1,000 yards. The German anti-tank screen could kill it at twice that distance. Every time a British squadron charged, they ran the last 1,000 yards through a storm of armor-piercing shot before they could even begin to shoot back. The men inside these tanks knew. They had been told. The Battle of Bir el Gubi, 2 days before the catastrophe at Sidi Rezeg, had already served as a brutal preview. On the 19th of November, the 22nd Armored Brigade, composed of 3 territorial yeomanry regiments, the 2nd Royal Gloucestershire Hussars, the 3rd County of London Yeomanry, and the 4th County of London Yeomanry, known as the Sharpshooters, had charged headlong into the dug-in Italian Ariete Armored Division at Bir el Gubi. The yeomanry had crossed the start line with 158 new Crusader tanks. They had lost around 50 to enemy action and another 30 or more to mechanical breakdown in a single afternoon, reducing the brigade to half strength before it had fired a shot at a German. Corporal Ron Dallas of the Royal Gloucestershire Hussars would later remember the moment the truth landed. He wrote that the men discovered, to their bitter cost, that their 2-pounder guns were useless against the German tanks. He called the 10 days that followed nothing but absolute chaos. And yet the brigade was ordered onwards because Tobruk had to be relieved and because the map in Cairo still insisted that the numbers favored the attackers. The 7th Armored Brigade, meanwhile, had been doing better. Under Brigadier George Davey, the central column had advanced through Broken Desert on the 18th and 19th of November without serious resistance. And at 10 minutes to 2 on the afternoon of the 19th, the armored cars of B Squadron, 4th South African Armored Car Regiment, scouting ahead, had crested the escarpment and reported that they were looking down on the Sidi Rezeg landing ground, with German aircraft still sitting on it. The 6th Royal Tank Regiment, leading the attack after boggy ground had forced the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment to detour west, came over the lip of the escarpment at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and rolled straight across the airfield. 19 German aircraft were captured on the ground. 3 others managed to scramble into the air and make low-level strafing runs on the British tanks before vanishing westward. C Squadron, 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, was ordered to destroy the captured aircraft. They did it with sledgehammers and pickaxes because they could not spare the ammunition. The 7th Support Group, under Brigadier John Charles Campbell, known throughout the 8th Army as Jock Campbell, dug in on the escarpment with their 25-pounder field guns and their 2-pounder anti-tank guns. They had walked straight into Rommel's rear. The atmosphere in the British headquarters at Bagush was electric. The crucial ground had been seized. The breakthrough was on. What they did not yet realize was that Rommel had also walked into a decision. Looking at his map on the night of the 19th, the German commander had finally accepted that Operation Crusader was a full offensive and not a reconnaissance. He ordered General Ludwig Kruwel, commanding the Afrika Korps, to break off his operations along the frontier, concentrate the 15th Panzer Division and the 21st Panzer Division into a single mailed fist, and swing them northwest. The objective was simple: destroy the British force sitting on the Sidi Rezeg escarpment before the Tobruk garrison could break out to meet it. For the whole of the 20th of November, the Panzer divisions maneuvered across the open desert, sparring with the 4th and 22nd Armored Brigades in an inconclusive swirl of engagements around Gabr Saleh. British tank crews refueled and rearmed in the dark, often losing contact with their supply columns, flashing torches to find their own vehicles in the black desert night. By dawn on the 21st of November, the Afrika Korps was exactly where Rommel wanted it. 30 miles southeast of Sidi Rezeg, fueled, ammunitioned, and ready to strike at first light. 150 panzers accompanied by a screen of motorized infantry and, critically, a full allocation of 88mm guns mounted on half-tracks. At Sidi Rezeg itself, the 7th Armored Brigade had received fresh orders for the 21st. The plan was to push north at 8:30 that morning. The 7th Support Group Infantry, 1st King's Royal Rifle Corps, and elements of the 2nd Rifle Brigade, supported by 60th Field Regiment Royal Artillery with its 25-pounders, would assault the 2nd Escarpment and take the ridge above the Trig Capuzzo. Once that was taken, the 6th Royal Tank Regiment, minus A Squadron held in reserve, would descend the escarpment and drive north to Ed Duda to link up with the Tobruk breakout force. It was a bold plan, and it started brilliantly. The infantry attack at 8:30 went in with tremendous dash. Within an hour, the rifle companies were on the ridge, and by noon they had taken 700 Italian prisoners from the Bologna Division. But as 6th Royal Tank Regiment rolled forward to exploit the breach, they descended directly into the fire of a dug-in anti-tank screen that included at least one battery of 88s. The tanks of 6th RTR came apart on the lower slope of the escarpment. The regiment's charge northward to meet the Tobruk force would later be remembered by the men who survived it as the charge of the Light Brigade of the Desert. Only 6 tanks made it back. The commanding officer was missing, later reported killed. His second-in-command was missing, later reported killed. Both squadron leaders were missing, later reported killed. 4 other officers were missing. By the end of that day, 6th RTR had been reduced to 17 runners, and those were being commanded by a captain because every officer of higher rank in the fighting companies was either dead or in German hands. And while that was happening on the northern face of the escarpment, something worse was unfolding on the southern face. At 8:05 that morning, reconnaissance from the 4th South African Armored Cars, patrolling south of the airfield, radioed the report that would define the rest of the day. 150 tanks, 250 motor transport vehicles, moving at speed from the southeast, heading straight for Sidi Rezeg. The Afrika Korps had arrived. The 7th Queen's Own Hussars, which had been held in reserve on the plain below the airfield with their Mark 5B light tanks and their handful of A-13 cruisers, were ordered forward to a blocking position north of the advancing German column. The 2nd Royal Tank Regiment would support them on the left. What followed was not a battle in any sense that the cavalry manuals of Sandhurst had ever described. It was an execution. The 7th Hussars went forward with 57 tanks. Most of them were Mark 5B light tanks, each crewed by 3 men, each mounting nothing heavier than a machine gun. The handful of A-13 cruisers in the regiment had the 2-pounder, which at least had a chance of hurting a Panzer III if it could get close enough. The German column advanced in tight formation, 50 Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs in the leading wave, with anti-tank guns deploying on the flanks and more armor coming on behind. The range at which the Germans opened fire was later estimated at around 2,000 yards. At that distance, a British 2-pounder round fell short. A German 50-millimeter round, or worse, an 88-millimeter round, reached its target with energy to spare. The 7th Hussars operational report, written later that December in a camp behind the lines, recorded the situation in language drained of emotion. The enemy opened fire at long range. Several tanks of the 7th Hussars were destroyed before they could close to effective 2-pounder range. The report noted that the enemy column was densely packed and that had close artillery support been available at the commencement of the engagement, very heavy destruction of enemy tanks must have resulted. But the close artillery support was not available because the 25-pounders were firing north in support of the infantry attack on the 2nd Escarpment. The 7th Hussars were on their own. They did what British cavalry had done for 250 years. They charged. Troop by troop, squadron by squadron, the Mark 5-1Bs and the A-13s drove straight at the Panzer column, trying to close the gap to a range where their 2-pounders and their Besa machine guns could matter. The first to be hit were the command tanks, which were marked by taller radio aerials and which the German gunners had been trained to engage first. Lieutenant Colonel Bias's tank was knocked out. Bias himself was killed. The squadron leaders went down in the next few minutes. A gunner in one of the surviving tanks, R.D. Lawrence, who would later write a memoir of what happened inside a British tank when an 88-millimeter round penetrated the turret, described the experience as something close to being inside a cathedral bell when it was struck by lightning. The noise, the pressure, the spray of molten metal, the sudden silence as most of the crew died in the same instant. He lived. Most of those hit that morning did not. The Mark 5B light tanks, with their 14 millimeters of armor, offered their crews almost nothing. A 50-millimeter round from a Pak 38 went through one side and out the other, usually taking crew members with it. An 88-millimeter round left very little of the tank recognizable. When the survivors pulled back at midday, the 7th Hussars had 10 tanks still running, out of 57. Several of those 10 had been hit. By the time the next dawn came, the regiment would effectively be combat ineffective. By the 28th of November, only 2 of the 7th Hussars tanks remained. The 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, supporting on the left, was roughly handled as well, though they fared better than the Hussars because their A-13 cruisers had the 2-pounder rather than machine guns, and because they operated on ground that gave them some cover against the long-range guns. Still, their losses were heavy. The 8th Hussars, belonging to 4th Armored Brigade, which had been rushing to support, arrived late that day after their own grim morning in which A Squadron had been wiped out, attempting to close with an enemy whose guns outranged theirs. Major C.E.R. Duff, the squadron leader, had been mortally wounded in that charge. The 8th Hussars' own account of the 22nd of November would use a single word: disastrous. By the evening of the 21st, the 7th Armored Brigade, which had crossed into Libya with around 129 tanks in its 3 regiments, could put only 28 into the line. The 4th and 22nd Armored Brigades, hurrying north in scattered columns, were still out of touch with each other and low on fuel. The Sidi Rezegh position was held by one shattered armored brigade, the exhausted infantry of Jock Campbell's support group, and a ring of 25-pounder field guns firing over open sights. And Rommel knew it. Into this moment stepped the figure who would carry the battle on his shoulders. Brigadier Jock Campbell was 47 years old, a Scotsman from Thurso in Caithness, a Royal Horse artillery officer, a first-class horseman who had captained the British equestrian team at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. He was tall, heavily built, and he had the English officer's unshakable good looks that the correspondent Alan Moorhead would later describe with something close to reverence. He had already won a Distinguished Service Order and bar in the earlier desert fighting. Now, with the Africa Corps bearing down on his position and the armored brigade he was supposed to be supporting effectively wrecked, Campbell did something that no manual recommended and no staff officer would have approved. He went forward. He climbed into an open command car. He strapped a large blue flag to a stick so that his remaining tanks could see him through the dust, and he began driving up and down the forward positions under direct fire from German tanks and guns, personally forming up counterattacks. The citation for the Victoria Cross that Jock Campbell would be awarded for the actions of the 21st and 22nd of November describes what he did in terms that read, even today, like something out of an earlier century of warfare. He personally carried out reconnaissance for counterattacks by his tanks, whose senior officers had all become casualties early in the day. Standing in his car with a blue flag, he formed up tanks under close and intense fire from all natures of enemy weapons. On the following day, when the enemy attacks were intensified, he was always in the forefront of the heaviest fighting, encouraging his troops, staging counterattacks with his remaining tanks, and personally controlling the fire of his guns. On 2 occasions, he himself manned a gun to replace casualties. Moorhead, who was a witness to some of it, wrote later that when Campbell's car began to fall behind the moving tanks, he simply leapt onto the side of one of them, hung on to the turret, and directed the battle from there. They said, Moorhead wrote, that Jock Campbell won the Victoria Cross half a dozen times that day. He was wounded on the 22nd, but he refused evacuation and kept fighting. The German general Johann von Ravenstein, commander of 21st Panzer Division, who would later be taken prisoner, reportedly sent Campbell a letter of congratulation, expressing his greatest admiration for Campbell's skill on what Ravenstein called those hot days, and recalling the many irons, as he put it, that flew near the aerodrome around the ears of everyone involved. The 22nd of November brought the second hammer blow. The 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, reinforced and refueled, resumed their attack on the airfield with everything they had. By mid-afternoon, the German panzers had broken through the thin British line on the southern edge of the airfield and were rolling across the landing ground itself. The 7th Support Group artillery fought them at point-blank range. Gun crews were overrun on their pieces. Jock Campbell was everywhere at once, firing guns himself when the crews went down, directing tanks into positions that had no right to hold. By that evening, with the Germans in possession of the Sidi Rezegh Ridge and the British forced back onto the upper escarpment, the 22nd Armored Brigade had lost so many tanks that the sharpshooters were amalgamated into a single composite regiment under Lieutenant Colonel William Carr. The 3rd County of London Yeomanry's War Diary for the 22nd recorded Captains Stanley Reddish and Colin Scott Moncrief simply as missing and not heard of again. Both were later confirmed killed, along with troopers Andrew Stewart, Charles Croker King, and William Smart. The casualties were not statistics to the men writing them down. They were the friends who had shared a bivouac the night before, the gunners who had calibrated a sight together that morning. The 23rd of November, a Sunday, added a final horror to the ledger. The 5th South African Brigade, which had at last come up from Bir el Gubi to support the British at Sidi Rezeg, was caught in the open by a concentrated attack from the 15th Panzer Division, the 21st Panzer Division, and the Italian Ariete Division. The brigade was effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. The 3rd Field Regiment, Transvaal Horse Artillery, tried to dig in, but the ground was solid limestone, and in many places they could only scrape trenches 9 inches deep. The South African gunners fired their 25-pounders over open sights at German tanks moving through their position. They saved only 5 of their 24 guns. The rest were overrun. Brigadier Willoughby Norrie, commanding XXX Corps, would later say that the South African sacrifice had been the turning point. Perhaps it was. But on that Sunday evening, looking at the wreckage of 3 armored brigades and 1 infantry brigade, a man could have been forgiven for calling it a defeat. From the 18th to the 22nd of November alone, the British had lost 530 tanks. The Germans had lost about 100. The British had more tanks burning than the Germans had ever possessed in the theater. What made those days at Sidi Rezeg the worst day in the desert was not simply the numerical scale of the loss, though the numerical scale was staggering. It was the quality of the men lost and the speed at which it happened. These were not conscripts thrown into an unfamiliar battle. The 7th Armored Division were the original desert rats, men who had fought through the Italian campaigns of 1940, through Beta Foam and Sidi Barrani and Operation Battle Axe. They knew the desert. They had the best combat experience of any armored division in the British Army. And they had been destroyed in a matter of days by an enemy who understood something they did not. The Germans understood that tanks alone could not win in the desert. They fought with combined arms. They used their panzers as bait and their anti-tank guns as the killing tool. They taught the British a lesson that would cost thousands more lives before it was fully learned, and that would not be properly absorbed into British armored doctrine until late 1942. The cost of that lesson was paid in the names on the war diaries of the 7th Hussars, the 8th Hussars, the 6th Royal Tank Regiment, the 2nd Royal Gloucestershire Hussars, and the 2 sharpshooter regiments of the City of London. And yet, against every reasonable expectation, Operation Crusader did not fail. It was saved by 3 things the British commanders had not counted on and which they did not fully understand at the time. The first was Rommel's own overreach. On the 24th of November, flushed with what he believed was a decisive victory, Rommel ordered the infamous dash to the wire, sending his 2 panzer divisions careering southeast towards the Egyptian frontier in an attempt to cut off the British rear. The move caused panic in the British logistic areas, but drew the Africa Corps away from the battlefield for 48 critical hours, giving the shattered British armored brigades time to refuel, regroup, and recover. The second was the arrival of the 2nd New Zealand Division, pushing westward along the Trig Capuzzo, a fresh infantry formation of extraordinary fighting quality that would recapture the Sidi Rezeg escarpment on the 25th and link up with the Tobruk garrison at Ed Duda on the 27th. The third, and perhaps the most important, was the sheer stubbornness of men like Jock Campbell, who had refused to break even when the arithmetic said they were beaten. When General Bernard Freyberg of the New Zealand Division was later asked about difficult operations, he is recorded as saying that he always comforted himself and his senior commanders with the thought that nothing they were about to attempt could possibly be as hazardous as the approach to relieve Tobruk had been at Sidi Rezeg. It was the benchmark for hardship in the 8th Army. Tobruk was relieved on the 10th of December, 1941. The siege had lasted 242 days. The cost of the relief in men and tanks and aircraft had been appalling. Jock Campbell was promoted Major General and given command of the 7th Armored Division in February 1942. 3 weeks after his promotion, he was killed when his staff jeep overturned on a stretch of newly laid clay road near Halfia. His driver, Major Roy Farron, who had been his aide-de-camp and who later became famous in his own right for Special Forces service, was thrown clear of the wreck and survived. Farron would later admit that sitting beside the body of his dead commander in the desert, waiting for a medical team that might or might not come, he had considered taking his own life. Campbell is buried in Cairo War Memorial Cemetery. The 7th Queen's Own Hussars, after their annihilation at Sidi Rezeg, were withdrawn, re-equipped with American M3 Stuart light tanks, and shipped to Burma in January 1942 to fight the Japanese advance on Rangoon. They would fight the last 150 miles of that campaign as infantry, having been forced to destroy their own tanks when the fuel ran out. The regiment that had been destroyed in 90 minutes on a Libyan escarpment would keep fighting in different uniforms and different theaters until the end of the war. What Sidi Rezeg taught, and what it still teaches anyone willing to read the war diaries, is that courage is not a substitute for the right weapon, and that the gap between what a crew can do and what its equipment will allow it to do is sometimes measured in the seconds between the flash of a muzzle and the arrival of a shell. The men in the 7th Hussars light tanks that morning of the 21st of November knew before they crossed the start line that their guns could not reach the Germans. They went anyway. They did it because the orders came, and because the men in the tanks next to them were going, and because there was, in that moment, nothing else a British cavalry regiment knew how to do. A regiment was destroyed in the time it takes to boil a kettle and drink the tea. A commander won the Victoria Cross standing on the side of a moving tank holding a blue flag. An airfield changed hands 3 times in 6 days. And somewhere in the desert south of Tobruk, in graves that most of their families never visited and many of them never knew existed, the crews of 57 tanks from a regiment that traced its lineage to 1690 passed into silence. That is why it was the worst day in the desert. Not because the British lost, because in the end, in the long balance sheet of the campaign, they did not. But because of what it cost to keep fighting after the first 90 minutes had already told them what the price was going to be.